when you first read these or say them, it's normal not to believe, right? And what you're doing, you're actually brainwashing yourself in a positive way, not a negative way, to what you feed your mind is what you will start to think. So the more you feed yourself with positive material, including the counters or affirmations, one day you will wake up believing what you've been feeding your mind. It'll be more automatic, but it does take some time and effort.
Awekenge, this is Mental Metals, hosted by Asego Toto. Hello everyone, welcome to another episode of Mental Matters. I'm your host, Asego Toto, and before we dive into today's incredible conversation, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy what you hear today, please take a moment to rate and review our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Your feedback not only helps us improve, but also helps others discover the valuable insights we share every week. And if you find today's episode particularly inspiring or insightful, don't forget to share it with your friends, family, or anyone you think could benefit from it. Thank you for your support. It truly means the world to us. Now, let's get back into our conversation. You've dedicated your career to helping survivors of trauma. What drew you to this field, and what has kept you motivated over the years?
Okay. I am also a personal trauma survivor of complex trauma.
Mm.
And complex trauma means the trauma started in childhood.
Mm.
And usually complex trauma survivors, there's other traumatic incidents across the lifespan. So it's childhood and some ongoing traumatic events. So I didn't know I was always going to want to be an expert in the field though, because it's really hard work. And like you mentioned earlier, it can be kind of messy and people want to avoid it. It's challenging. But however, I learned early in my career as a therapist that I was just naturally gifted or talented in empowering and healing survivors.
Mm.
So when that just sort of started to happen, I was like, well, I'm going to be all in. And then not only am I a licensed therapist, I have taken all the trauma certifications that I could take to be really well-rounded in the space. So I'm involved with the Trauma Research Foundation. I've taken a lot of different certification courses in the different areas of trauma healing. And I just really am passionate about the work I do.
Most of the time, when it comes to when I see someone that have experienced themselves a certain thing, whether in terms of mental health issues or in a way of trauma, I feel like by default they make it their mission, their cause to be able to be part of the conversation, to be the change they actually see, to the change they want to actually see in a way of. Because speaking about myself, I also had a very traumatic event that happened to me, and that led to some mental health problems, whereas I dealt with anxiety, I dealt with depression, I dealt with paranoia, and having dealt with PTSD. It was, in all honesty, it was hard for me because back then I didn't actually know what actually it was. What was PTSD? What was depression, anxiety? What was in general spectrum of what was mental health? So I took it by myself. I took a mental of actually, let me be there in the forefront of this conversation. Let me type elements to learn what is mental health, what is depression, what is anxiety. So in your perspective, would you say that that your trauma motivated you in terms of pursuing in a way of you being a therapist?
Yes, 1,000%.
Mm, mm,
Yeah.
mm, mm,
Yeah. And during one of my early traumas, there was actually a social worker assigned to me
mm,
who, I don't know what word to use to describe his approach, but I feel looking back that he was pretty incompetent and not trauma informed or trauma,
mm,
I
mm,
should say
mm,
trauma. But he said to me, just meeting me for the first time, and I was like 12 years old.
mm,
And he said to me, I heard you've been a really bad girl, and I bet you're doing drugs, and I can't believe you're treating your family this way, and I'm sure you're promiscuous, and all this judgments, none of it true. I never even saw a drug at 12 years old. I mean, I lived in the middle of nowhere, isolated area. And and I was not promiscuous. And I want to say, even if I was promiscuous, which would be a trauma response, even if I was on drugs, which would be a trauma response as well, it wouldn't have given him the right to say what he did, right?
mm,
He he opened up the conversation this way, and I remember thinking that moment, wow, if I had his position, I would not treat people this way.
mm, mm,
So it really was one of the, I don't think it was the main catalyst, but it was one of them. I was like, wow, you know, when whatever career I do, if I help people, I want to be way more empathetic.
mm,
Of
mm,
course, I didn't have that language at 12 years old. Empathetic
mm.
is like later.
Mm.
Yeah. So I hope that kind of answers your question.
It does, cause one thing that I've realized that it's a pity that we aren't able, in a way of we don't have a say who should be our therapist. When I say that it's a pity who shouldn't be our therapist is the fact that some people are incompetent and actually are not, as you said, trauma aware in terms of not knowing actually the experiences. And one thing that I keep on saying when I have a guest on this podcast, when we have a similar conversation when it comes to therapy, is the fact that I rather have someone that has went through that certain thing that I've went through that understands where I come from. Because to someone that is normal, they actually don't understand the reason why I'm acting this way, the reason why I actually do the things that I do. It goes back to a conversation that I recently had with a guest, and whereas we spoke about teenagers and how parents should actually navigate it. And I raised something that I feel like that is important to this conversation is the fact that sometimes the reason why we go out there in terms of chil- teenagers of doing drugs, doing alcohol, the fact that there's something wrong at home and not being aware of such conversations of, okay, there's this thing called drugs, there's this thing called alcohol. In a way of being aware of mental health, being aware of actually what does the actual world entail. So I just wanted to add in terms of saying that, do you have anything to add what I just said?
Well, I actually got stuck at the beginning of what you were saying because I had a comment then. So you may have to repeat part of that. But the part that stuck out to me is I think you said not normal. And I want to say that trauma survivors were still normal people.
Mm,
But when we have behaviors that seem kind of abnormal, it's because of what's happened to us is abnormal. So another way to say this is we have a normal reaction to an abnormal situation. So, in other words, if you are a trauma survivor, it's normal to have trust issues. It's normal to have sleep, appetite issues. It's normal to have relationship issues and communication issues. It's normal to struggle in different areas.
mm,
What's abnormal is what happened to us. So, had the trauma not happened, we would probably feel much more normal.
mm.
I wanted to say that.
And also to add on that, I feel like there's this thing that I always have within my mind is the fact that sometimes what if in terms of a survivor is the normal one and the abnormal one are the exact people they think that are normal. Because when it comes to such conversations and when you are trauma survivor, I would say tend to use the suicidal, suicidal pressures in terms of saying that no, the thing that you're doing is not normal. The thing that you're doing is not in a way of I feel like putting the words of the way that you are the thing that you are doing is not the thing that you are used to. And that's how I in a way of I view it. Speaking about trauma survivors, can you share some common themes or challenges that survivors often face?
All right. So, I will, but I want you to know that list is really long. Okay. And not every survivor will have all the same symptoms or all the same problems. But the list of possible symptoms and problems is really, really huge. It is my belief that trauma can impact every single area of our life. So I will start with health.
Mm,
Trauma can impact our physical health, and some people will say, "Well, where or why?" It impacts our neurological system, so it can cause migraines. I have a client that has seizures, and the doctors believe it's because of her trauma history. So without the trauma, she wouldn't have seizures. It can cause IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, and acid reflux. Anything in the gastric system can be impacted by trauma.
mm,
It impacts our immunity. With chronic stress, our immunity goes down. And so we attract illnesses more easily than other people, or we can.
mm,
It impacts our muscular skeletal. So we end up having a lot of chronic pain. Things hurt faster on us.
mm, mm, mm,
And that's skin issues. We tend to have more allergies than the average person. Heart issues. There's a lot of research. There's a famous doctor. Her name is Nadine Burks. She's from the Caribbean and has a TED Talk as well as a really good book. It's called The Deepest Well, and it studies the impact of childhood trauma on health. And the inner city youth that she's worked with, she noticed this pattern. They had a lot of asthma, you know?
mm,
So, and again, not every survivor, you're not going to have every single medical condition, or at least I
mm,
hope not, right? But the fact that we can suffer on a physical level so powerfully, I think is pretty profound.
mm, mm,
Okay.
mm,
Okay. So that's one area. Okay. So let me move on to the spiritual area. Survivors sometimes have a hard time with believing in a higher power. So we either struggle with not trusting or believing, and sometimes we're very much comforted from it. Like there's people on both sides of that.
mm,
But it's normal, I think, to question, like, why would God put us in this situation? Like why did God allow this to happen? And especially when we look at the tragedies around the world. And I also work with a lot of military,
mm,
and when they've been in combat and had to kill in order to not be killed, right? Um, there's a lot of more what we call moral injury with that, especially if your belief is in the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill, and
mm,
then you kill. Like it's really hard to be at peace with that. for so many survivors. So the spiritual piece is like the moral injury. It's some people stop believing in God if they did believe. Some people feel angry at God. So it just causes a lot of spiritual confusion, or it can.
Mm,
Mental health, I think you mentioned several things already. It can cause depression, it can cause anxiety, obviously post traumatic stress, it can cause acute stress. And my first job as a therapist at a graduate school, I worked with people that had schizophrenia.
mm,
On my caseload at the time, I think there was 18 people that I worked with, on a daily basis. And out of those 18 people, 17 of them had really horrific trauma. So it made me kind of wonder about the connection between trauma, like severe trauma and schizophrenia, like
mm,
psychosis. And so that was really fascinating to me. And that there is some research that supports that. And of course, there could be other components to that, like genetics and other things that about the brain, right?
mm,
But I found that very interesting. So it makes me wonder, had they not had that trauma history, would they have gotten so sick um, decapacitated from schizophrenia?
mm,
Okay.
mm.
So I believe it makes me wonder, would we really have mental illness to the degree we have it if there wasn't so much trauma? I think you have a question.
Yes, in a way of it's something that I like to add and also a question. In terms of trauma, and I feel like the real reason why trauma is so big and people haven't actually resolved their trauma is the fact that our own parents weren't aware of that it was trauma. They, we normalize it. Actually, not let's say parents, but grandparents normalize to the fact that no, it's cool. I'm used to this. And in terms of acceptance,
It's sort of
yeah. And if you would have asked me in terms of what do I think about beliefs 30 days ago or 2 months ago, I wouldn't be able to answer you when it comes to mental health. The reason why I'm saying this is the fact that I had a conversation with a guest yesterday. Eh, actually, it wasn't yesterday. I think it was Monday. Whereas we actually spoke about something that was eye-opening to me and something that I didn't actually always see. It's beliefs. Beliefs, when we hear the word beliefs, we quickly go to religion and in a way and how it actually impacts us. Same goes with when, for example, I like to tell the story of my when I had a fractured wrist and dislocated wrist at the same time on the same wrist. Whereas instead of crying about it, I saw it as a lesson. And the more in terms of relationships, I just want to talk about in terms of relationships. I'm not saying that a person that has I'm not disregarding the feelings of a person that has went through trauma. I I went through trauma and I know what kind of work one needs to have in order for them to actually accept themselves as the way they are. Because at some point we actually want to be accepted by society, want to have friends. And in order for us to have those friends, we put this facade of saying, no, I'm not that. Start thinking of putting this facade and pretend to be everything's all right, whereas nothing's all right. You are still suffering. And in a way of what I'm trying to get into is the fact that beliefs I feel like, puts us down in a way of realizing that having a mental health problem is not normal. Going back to what we speaking about in terms of normal. And when you have a mental health problem, you actually you don't want to be your friends. And the, to add on that, I just wanted to say in terms of quote Carl Jung a bit, whereas he said that I am not what happened to me, I am what I'll choose to become. And it's something that really speaks to me. And it's something that I've seen
Mm.
because people have this problem with acceptance, not with acceptance, acceptance and honest, of being honest with themselves, of saying that I'm open to this conversation of being having, be honest with myself that I'm suffering from a certain thing, for example, depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and or any type of mental health disorder. Once we reach that threshold, we are able to actually start doing the work. And it's something that I feel like it's important. And within that work, and try to incorporate self care and self love. Because one thing that I realized that it took me, I think, a whole year to actually love myself, actually really appreciating myself in a way of that I told myself that I won't get into any relationship and I just want to take care of myself. It was hard. And at some point, I feel like it was lonely. I was lonely and also being alone. It's something that at that point, I couldn't differentiate. But eventually, because of the self worth, because of what I did, eventually saw it. Look, this is nice. Taking care of myself is the most important thing that is that could work for me. Their self growth, and I'm saying that I have been talking a lot. Do you have anything to actually add on what I've said?
Talking because you say a lot of things I have thoughts about. So I'll share that. I you mentioned okay. Don't I'm going to say this and help me come back to it. Generational trauma and epigenetics. I want to say something about that. But I also want to go back to my original listing of how trauma can impact us over the lifespan, because you mentioned a couple of the things. One is it can impact our parenting,
Mm,
which is huge. And then, of course, it can impact our intimate relationships with partners. It can impact our work that we do in the world and our relationships with coworkers. A lot of the trauma survivors I work with have a hard time with authority. So it's hard to sometimes work with a supervisor or a boss, especially if they do anything that kind of reminds us of our abuse.
mm,
It could be like a direction they give us that just feels controlling, or something like that. And then the other thing you mentioned that reminded me of my list of how trauma can impact a person is it can impact our self-worth, our self-confidence, our self-love. So those were all comments from what you were saying. But going back to epigenetics and transgenerational trauma, is I tell my survivors, you have a couple choices. You can parent as you learned from your parents, or you can decide that that impacted you in ways that you don't appreciate or were harmful, and you can make a different decision. You can be what we call a chain breaker. You can
mm,
break that chain of transgenerational trauma.
mm,
So those are my comments. And epigenetics is the study of, like, we used to believe that trauma survivors abuse their kids because of just being parented in a certain way, but it's actually deeper than that. Like, there's a study of epigenetics that trauma gets stored inside of our cells. And so in utero, when you're in your mother's stomach, if she was under any kind of trauma or major stress at that time, you come into the world with some of that burden. It's in your genes and your cells. And so trauma is very complex,
mm,
but it's also very hopeful. The more we learn to understand trauma, which it's still very young in the research world,
mm,
very young. If you look at the whole time span, right? And so the more that we learn about the impact, we also learn more about how to heal it. So healing is always possible with trauma.
Hmm. And speaking about healing, one thing that I realize is the fact that for people it's hard when it comes to healing. And speaking in a perspective of currently I'm a student, yeah, at Nelson Mandela University. When it comes, first I just want to state this. I feel like I was blessed enough to be able to be aware of my surroundings. I quickly learned to have self-awareness. In all honesty, I don't know how. I don't know how I actually got it, but I was able to be aware.
I
And
think it's God. That's just my opinion.
probably team, because in a way of when I look at my surroundings, when as in terms of when it comes to relationships, when it comes to friendships, I'm able to learn a person without actually having being friends with them. And when it comes to relationship, in a way of I consider myself someone that's the reason why I'm mentioning that is the fact that I've seen the people that around me that have been dating. Because I remember back in high school, whereas I had this friend, and most of the time, you see people that are not meant for each other. The one always does things that you wouldn't consider doing the other person, and you keep on trying to warn them, but in the end, they eventually go back to those people. In your practice, how do you advise your clients to be able to actually choose self-worth? Because self-worthy is something that is quite difficult for one to actually acquire. And it takes a lot of work, same as self-care, same as self-love.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think my best answer for that, for the self-worth piece, is part of a therapeutic modality called CBT, like cognitive behavioral therapy, where there's in cognitive behavioral therapy, you learn how to be more aware of your belief system and how you think. And I get people to track that over the time, especially unhealthy or negative thoughts that they have that they want to fix, right? I teach them then how to organize their thoughts into categories. And then there's 5 analytical tools I teach on how to really examine your thinking process. Like, are there flaws in your thinking, and where could that flaw come from? You know? Then I do that. And then a piece that happens later in the process is you learn how to replace any negative cognitions you have with healthier beliefs that will help you grow as a person.
Mm.
And so it's called counters in CBT. You're countering negative thoughts with healthier beliefs. A lot of lay people call that affirmations, and a lot of times they use them incorrectly. The wording is not right. They haven't done that deeper work. And so it's not as effective, right? And I love counters or affirmations. I found a lot of evidence of them in the Bible too about our worth. And when I say Bible, I mean any spiritual text
Mm.
has a lot of this stuff, like the golden rule. You treat people how you want to be treated. Um, most spiritual texts lift us up, and if they're not, we got to look at why that is or question that piece.
Mm.
Um, so long story short, like if somebody wants a cheat code for not taking cognitive behavioral therapy and wanted to speed it up, what I would normally say to people is you want to take positive statements that you want to believe about yourself that you currently don't. And you want to practice those first thing in the morning when you wake up, last thing you do before you go to bed. And then I suggest, like, I made this up, based on experience, 25 years of watching my clients and working with them. And then throughout the day. So these affirmations, I tell them, You put them on your refrigerator, you put them on your computer wallpaper, your phone wallpaper, you put them in your purse or your wallet, you put them on your dashboard, like your bathroom, you're everywhere. Like you wanted that exposure of that positive message. And so, an example of positive messaging for worth are things like, I am lovable. I am worthy. I am capable of learning. I am improving every day, or I am healing every day. And when you first read these or say them, it's normal not to believe, right? What you're doing, you're actually brainwashing yourself in a positive way, not a negative way, to the what you feed your mind is what you will start to think. So more you feed yourself with positive material, including the counters or affirmations, one day you will wake up believing what you've been feeding your mind.
Mm.
It'll be more automatic, but it does take some time and effort. So if you told me that you are going out tomorrow and running 10 miles in a marathon and you haven't been running, that's probably not going to work out very well, right? And it's the same with our mental health. Like if you tell me that you want to believe I am worthy, yet you've done your affirmations or counters once or twice, it's not going to work. The things that we really want to change in our life take a lot of effort. It really does. There's no other way to change without the effort.
But it's more like that in a way of actually before I say it, but let me just say it's more of that David Goggins mentality in terms of achieving your, I would say that your best and actually creating excuses for yourself to actually pursue a, I would say, better life, your better mental well-being. And I just want to speak on more on affirmation. When it comes to affirmations, what I say that I don't think that I'm fan in a way because it's easy to put the affirmations on the wall and say that you're gonna do these things, gonna do these things. I believe in action because if you're gonna put those affirmations before you do something, I feel like in a way of you're lying to yourself, going back to manipulating the mind in a way of actually thinking a different way. And one thing about that I realized about the mind is the fact that you can't tell the difference between perception and reality. Sometimes, as much as we might actually manipulate the mind in a good way, but sometimes there's a limit within ourselves, within doing a thing.
I can address that.
And it's something that I've seen within myself of actually realizing that I want to do this and this and this and this and this and this. For example, I told myself that I am going to actually try to learn new information because there was this course that I was doing, and it's a short course in terms of tourism, and in a week it bored me, and I thought that it will help me to actually add on my experience, add on my in terms of the diploma that I'm actually pursuing, and I became bored. So sorry. What actually, in terms of addressing the issue in terms of information,
I missed that question.
in
Say
terms
again.
of you, in terms of addressing that thing of actually having that, of not actually encouraging a person to actually be more aware, being able to use information in their advantage. What would you say?
Yeah. Yeah. Because you brought up something important with the action, right? And so my realist, I also call them very stubborn people, stubborn thinkers. They think it's woo woo or wishy washy to practice affirmations, right?
Mm.
And so what I say is like they're the people that really need the cognitive behavioral therapy course because there's a lot of analysis and evidence to what I'm saying. But yes, action taking is huge. same with like the law of attraction, the belief that you can create whatever you want. I do believe in that, but you can't just sit around thinking about what you want. You've got to take the action.
Definitely,
You
definitely.
got to take the next step. So everything's about taking the next step in the direction that you want to go to. And so for people that are struggling with their worth or any kind of affirmations, maybe the next step is you talk to a therapist and work with a therapist.
Mm,
Then maybe the next step is finding a course that aligns with what you want to be or do next that would help you feel, help you further along your beliefs. So
mm,
yes,
mm.
I people with anxiety, not all trauma survivors, but my trauma survivors that are riddled with a lot of anxiety, they tend to be very stubborn in their brain. And so I tell them that's okay. There's a reason why you think the way you do. And if you want to improve that, you can either have faith in the process and try some of the things I suggest. Um, you can have faith in the process, or you can simply take action in trying it and see how it goes. And my stubborn people, oh, and I've done research. Like I haven't published on this. I could. When I say I've done research, like I've had groups of people in my course. I give them a before survey on symptoms of anxiety and depression. I give them the survey in the middle of treatment and at the end. And when I've done this, the people at the end, the surveys of their symptoms have gone down more than 80%. So they're 80% less anxious, 80% less depressed. And that's the average. Like a lot of people it's like high 90s. Like if they had panic attacks, they stop having panic attacks. If they had suicidal thoughts, those have gone away doing the steps, taking the actions in the course, which is daily assignments, right?
Mm,
Like
mm.
there's a lot of action to be taken. People don't get better just by talk therapy. Usually,
Definitely.
it's
And
action.
and it's something that I just want to add in terms of action and in terms of evidence. And I'd like to actually quote Alex Hamos where he said, "We don't know what is going to happen, but we have this evidence that would support that this decision makes sense. If we still don't want to make it, then that is not logical." And as people, I realized that if we told ourselves that we were gonna do something, we're gonna do it. And it's more or less of having in faith in the unknown. And that's how I actually view everything because this podcast has taught me a lot. It has taught me a lot in a way of being able to live in the unknown. Having the fact that, yes, this thing, it's impossible at the moment, but eventually I will get it. And also, I saw your message, and also I have another. I was actually gonna close with this quote. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it,
I really enjoyed our talk.
and it gave me a different perspective when it comes to trauma, and that's the goal of this podcast: being able to allow the audience to have a different perspective and a different eye-opening conversation with themselves. So thank you so much. And before I let you go, before I say that, I would definitely, I saw that you have a podcast, so I'll add it on the link of this episode and be able to, so that people can actually hear you in terms of what you all about and in terms of what does your podcast entails, and also please, can you please actually mark the episode complete on Hotmax? And it
I
really helps me in terms of people actually continuing the conversation around trauma, around mental health in general. With those are things so much for being here. Really appreciate your time. Really appreciate your insights. I believe that they were very good. Thank you so much for the work there, Jed.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com.